Given all that talk of parties and the party leadership in crisis, we'll be joined by Conservative Party Chair Oliver Dowden. Labour's leadership has been biding its time, but has now called for Boris Johnson to resign. I'll speak to Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting. A man who knows plenty about leading the Conservative Party when it's well behind in the polls is former leader Iain Duncan Smith. He's also deeply concerned about the urgent warning from MI5 this week of a Chinese agent influencing MPs. Well, you'll have heard the name Sue Gray again and again and again this week. She's the senior civil servant holding an investigation into parties held in Downing Street. So much for faceless bureaucrats. I'll speak to the General Secretary of the Whitehall Union, the FDA, Dave Penman. And with the imminent threat of another Russian invasion of Ukraine and rising global tensions, I've spoken to Kurt Volker. He was US Ambassador to NATO and US Special Representative for Ukraine, having served under Presidents Bush, Obama and Trump. But first, I'm joined by the Chair of the Conservative Party, Oliver Dowden. Good morning, Mr. Dowden.
Good morning.
Can we just start with the issue that I think will still concern most people in this country? Is Omicron in retreat?
Well, we've seen some very promising data, whether that's in relation to infections or hospitalisations. And that, of course, hasn't happened by accident. It's happened because so many people have taken that booster vaccine. And thanks to the drive we gave it before Christmas, we've now got over 60% of the total population covered with the booster vaccine, and actually over 90% of over 50. So that gives us pause for hope and optimism that we may be emerging from the worst of Omicron. So it is good news, but it's thanks to all that hard work that has happened.
Should we then expect the lifting of the restrictions when the review comes in 10 days' time?
Well, it's always been my hope that we would have the Plan B restrictions for the shortest period possible. I'm under no doubt the kind of burdens this puts hospitality, wider business, schools and so on under, and I want us to get rid of those if we possibly can. The signs are encouraging, but clearly we'll wait to see the data ahead of that final decision.
But the likelihood is that that is what will happen. Those restrictions will be lifted unless we see something surprising in the data.
Well, it all seems to be heading in the right direction, particularly crucially in relation to hospitalisations, which seem to be plateauing. You've seen those very good headline numbers. It's heading in the right direction now. I'm very hopeful and optimistic, but clearly we'll await the data at the point of the decision before making that final decision.
Let me ask you about another big challenge facing government. Mr. Putin has essentially brewed a rather dangerous situation on the border with Ukraine. He's got 100,000 troops there waiting for his orders. The negotiations in Vienna this week basically drew a blank. What's the government doing to avoid war?
Well, it is important that we have that kind of engagement that we saw in Vienna, and we were represented by Minister Cleverly at that. We continue to work with the United States and with our allies, and we need to continue to be robust, as we have been, in saying to Russia that if it infringes on the sovereignty of the Ukraine, it will face severe consequences. We need to be united in sending that message, and we are.
What do severe consequences look like? I mean, what does that mean?
Well, we have said that there will be severe economic consequences, sanctions regimes and so on, where that happen. Russia needs to be in no doubt at all that we would not allow this to happen without those consequences. Clearly, the Defence Secretary has said this is a different matter given that Ukraine isn't a member of NATO when it comes to direct Western military intervention. But nonetheless, we will be very robust in our action. I know that President Biden is very much committed to that, and of course he has been in touch with Prime Minister Boris Johnson about that.
Look, I've asked you about two major challenges facing the government. I could equally have asked about the cost of living and the energy prices, or Brexit and Northern Ireland, or the ballooning fiscal deficit, or about the Chinese Communist Party's infiltration of Parliament. Yet all of that is being dwarfed this morning and day after day by the series of revelations about conduct in number 10 Downing Street and, by the way, the conduct of the Prime Minister and Mrs. Johnson. When do you plan to tell Boris Johnson that if the Conservative Party is to lead us through these challenges, he can no longer be Prime Minister. You can't afford him anymore.
Well, I don't agree with that analysis. I think Boris Johnson should, of course, remain as our Prime Minister. And I'll tell you why. It's precisely for the conversation we were just having now. It was the Prime Minister that made that call about having the mass booster programme, which has ensured we're getting through the worst Omicron. At the same time, he made the call, despite the huge pressure, and you may have remembered this, I recall it, around having a further lockdown in the face of that Omicron variant. He made the right call and has meant that we've managed to have the most open economy in Europe and the most vaxxed economy in Europe. The two are linked together. And I think when it comes to those big calls, he's made the right call. Now, of course, I don't diminish for a second that the kind of events that we've seen were totally wrong. I was angered by them. My constituents were angered by them. The whole country was angered by them. And it's absolutely right. The Prime Minister said we'll get to the bottom of them. And I'll tell you that when he responds to the House of Commons, as he's committed to doing so, he will make sure that we address the kind of culture that has allowed that to happen in the first place.
It's going to have to be a pretty dramatic response. I mean, at the very least, your job is to get the Conservative Party back into government. You've turned an 80-seat majority 2 years ago into what is now a consistent 10% deficit in the polls. And that is down to Mr. Johnson. He is the obstacle to your doing your job.
Well, we all know that opinion polls vary. What matters to me
is that what matters
to the British people is, first of all, they rightly expect us to get a grip of this situation. It was totally wrong, the events that happened. It's absolutely right the Prime Minister's apologised, and he will need to take further steps, and he will take those further steps when he makes a statement to the House of Commons. But it is also the case that we need to address not just COVID, and thank goodness we're making progress as we come out of Omicron, but also on the consequences of COVID, whether that's clearing the NHS backlog or whether that's rebuilding the economy. We need that kind of leadership to get us through it. And that's what people expect. Of course, we take these things seriously and we must address them, but we must also address the consequences of COVID.
But what could he possibly say about what we already know has taken place that would change opinions about that culture you yourself mentioned, Downing Street and in Whitehall? I mean, what could he possibly say?
Well, of course, it's important that we first get to the facts of everything that happened. Now, the Prime Minister has already apologised in respect of one event that happened. We need to get all the facts. That's what Sue Gray's doing through her report. We need to look at how that stacks up against the rules at the time. And then the Prime Minister needs to respond to that. Now, you wouldn't expect me to get into the detail of that response, but what I can tell you from the many conversations I've had with the Prime Minister and what you saw from him in the House on Wednesday is that he is committed to upping our game. We must improve the culture. We must do better. I hear people's anger. I know it, and we've got to respond to that.
Yeah, but, you know, he himself said at PMQs, there was a party, I was there. I mean, we don't need Sue Gray to tell us. Tim, one of your own MPs, Tim Loughton, this morning has made that point. We don't need to know what Sue Gray might or might not have found in the dusty files or from some junior employees. He's told us himself.
Well, I think it's important to understand what the Sue Gray inquiry is doing. It's not just in relation to the event that happened, I believe, on the 20th of May. It first of all looks at the range of events where there's been speculation about what may have happened. But in addition to that, crucially, it also allows people to come forward and bring forward any further allegations so they can properly be examined. Once we've got a full picture of the facts independently, that will then allow the Prime Minister to respond to it. Now, of course, that is going to require a change of culture. And I know that the Prime Minister is committed to leading that. And I know that the Prime Minister feels a sincere sense of regret and has apologised profoundly for what happened. And that is genuine, but I think people need to hear that in the statement that he will make in response to the Sue Gray report.
Look, you know, we can bandy words about what Sue Gray may or may not produce. She can't do anything about it, actually, because all she can do is say what the facts are. In the end, in the slightly bizarre situation, it's the Prime Minister himself who will decide whether he, the Prime Minister, has broken the ministerial code. I mean, that's another piece of madness which we can return to another time. But I want to take you on to, if you like, the larger issue here, which we know about. Because there's a lot that we already know. And forgive me if I'm going to take a bit of time to lay this out. We know that 16th of April, 2021, night before Prince Philip's funeral, 2 boozy parties. 18th December 2020, cheese and wine night, days after London went into Tier 3. 16th of December 2020. 15th of December 2020. 14th December 2020, Conservative Party headquarters, party in the basement, I think. 10th of December, party at Department for Education. They've owned up to that. Parties, 27th of November 2020. 25th November 2020. 13th November 2020. 20th of May 2020, Prime Minister spoke about it this week. Make the most of the lovely weather. Prime Minister finally admitted to joining that party himself. The 15th of May 2020. These are the things we already know about. We don't have to have a civil servant to tell us about them. Oh, and by the way, there's every Friday wine time. Now, it's taken me ages to set that out. You're the party chairman. There were a lot of parties. All the while, people in their thousands were sticking to the rules, and your people were breaking them. One word, shameful, right? Just shameful.
Yes, it was completely unacceptable that this happened. I feel
unacceptable is a political word.
I feel I'm happy to use whichever adjectives you choose to express my anger at what happened. I'm angry about what happened. The Prime Minister is angry about what happened. It should not have happened. There needs to be a change in the culture. But what I would say to you is that it is important and it's right to ensure that we find the full facts of what happened. Of course, we've seen some of it and we can go through the detail of each one of them, but we need to get that full picture, which will then enable the Prime Minister to respond effectively. He will make a statement to Parliament. He will be held accountable in Parliament for his actions. I think that that is the proper and right process. And I don't for a minute step back or resile from the sense of anger that people feel about this. The question is, what do we do now? We need to find out the facts, and then the Prime Minister needs to respond effectively and to address the culture in Downing Street. And I know that he is committed to doing that.
Look, I know this is your job to come on and defend him, but, you know, it feels like the Prime Minister himself is part of the culture. And if I may say, everybody thinks you're a decent bloke, you're an honourable person. On that 20th of May, you were at the podium in Downing Street, giving the Downing Street briefing, telling us in good faith that we were not permitted to meet more than one other person outside our household. 1 hour later, the Prime Minister's out there in the party. I mean, he's made an absolute mug of you personally. I mean, don't you feel... how can you defend this?
Well, I'm not seeking to defend it, and nor is the Prime Minister. And if you look at what he said to the House of Commons on Wednesday, he gave a sincere apology for what happened. He gave an explanation for what had happened. It should not have happened, and that was a failure. And he has, in credit to the Prime Minister, owned up to that. The question for us now is how we go broader than just this and look at the wider cultural issues. But there's also a wider question about, given where we are with Omicron, as we emerge, what do we need to do? And I think alongside addressing this, we need to address the consequences of COVID, whether that's rebuilding the economy, whether that's cost of living, whether that is clearing the NHS backlog. And we also need to get that focus on that. And I know that the Prime Minister is committed to doing so.
Look, let me... you know, in the old days, people would have resigned by now, wouldn't they? I mean, but let's just deal with a specific example, because I think you've given me the answers that I guess you have to give. But I wonder if the government really understands what this anger is about. Let's take the weekend of April 16th, 17th and 18th last year. Let me remind you what took place on that Saturday. There was Her Majesty, Queen, isolated at the funeral of her husband of 70 years. She's unable to sit with her own family. If you don't, and let's not split hairs about the regulations, about the Sugre and all that kind of stuff. But most of the country was thinking about this that weekend. And I just wonder what kind of people have not just one, but two boozy farewell parties on the Friday night before this happens. I mean, when you have to go into Downing Street and meet these people, morally, how do you feel about that?
Well, first of all, we all shared and respected the tremendous dignity and selflessness that the Queen showed on this occasion, as she has done throughout her reign. And I was disgusted at the fact that there were parties taking place before this profound event of national mourning in our nation's history. It shouldn't have happened, and it was wrong. They have already apologised for doing so. It was just plain wrong, and it shouldn't have happened. But the point I'm making to you, Trevor, is that I think in order to move on from this, we first of all need to establish the full facts of what happened at all the different alleged events that took place, and that's the purpose of the Sue Gray inquiry. The next step is then for the Prime Minister to come to the House of Commons, to give a full response, to be held to account for that. But I can tell you that the Prime Minister is genuinely committed, both in demonstrating his remorse and apology for what happened, but also in taking steps to ensure that we address the kind of culture in Downing Street that enabled something like that to happen, which clearly should never have happened in the first place.
But I suppose what I'm really trying to get at, Mr. Dowden, is that I understand the process and all of that, but I just wonder whether, Prime Minister, or you really understand that process, however clean it is not going to answer the question that is being asked out there in the country. And if you'll forgive me, I've talked about this once before on this programme, and I hoped never to have to do it again. But I think there are thousands, millions of people across the country who will feel, frankly, rather as I do. Let's go back to that April 17th, 18th weekend. And I just want to say something about what I did that during the week. And I think other people have exactly the same story. That week, I saw my two daughters at various times outside. One was pregnant, one was very ill. Their mother, stepmother, and I weren't allowed to meet them together. We all stuck to the spirit and the letter of the rules. On the Saturday, after watching the funeral of Prince Philip, I went to one of my friends' 70th birthday parties. He'd hired a tent. He's got loads of friends, but he'd hired a tent for just 6 of us, so we could sit outside. He stuck to the spirit and the letter of the rules. At that dinner, I get a call. My daughter's collapsed, and as you will know, for months she'd been isolated. She was ill. By the following morning, she had died, and she had stuck to the spirit and letter of the rules. Now, there are going to be thousands of people who have that story in their background. And if I may say so, you are in here telling me about a civil servant's inquiry. That will not answer that anger. Does the Prime Minister really understand why people are angry?
Well, first of all, Trevor, I know how much you have suffered during this period, and I know how much so many people in this country have suffered, the privations that they have been subject to, the steadfastness with which people obeyed the rules, and it is totally wrong if there has been any way in which, and we've seen some examples of this, those rules have not been fully obeyed in Downing Street. What I'm trying to offer to you and to your viewers who may be watching this programme is to explain to you how the government is seeking to move forward through this. First of all, to establish all of the facts of what happened, and then the Prime Minister will be held to account in Parliament for what happened. And I want to assure you, and I want to assure any of your viewers listening, I've discussed this with the Prime Minister on many occasions. He has a sincere sense of remorse and regret at what happened, as do I, as do other members of the government.
All right, look, let me get back, forgive me, let me get back to actually doing my job here. The truth of the matter still is the politics of this are that you're facing a consistent poll deficit, biggest in eight years. And in reality, you know what the most decisive thing you, as party chair, could do about this. So let me just ask you again, when are you going to tell the Prime Minister that he himself is the principal object that stands in the way of your doing your job successfully, which is to get the Conservative Party re-elected to government?
Well, I do not believe that the Prime Minister should resign for the reasons that we have discussed in this interview. I do, though, think it is essential that we address the kind of failings that allowed this to happen, that the Prime Minister is held to account for what happened and addresses that in Parliament, and that we also build on the kind of work that we have done with the vaccine rollout programme to address the subsequent challenges of COVID, whether that's clearing the NHS backlog or rebuilding the economy. I think that that is the right approach, rather than going through a period of divisive leadership contests, which is not the sense that I get of what British people want us to be focusing on. They want us to focus on the job at hand of dealing with Omicron and then the consequences of COVID.
Oliver Dowden, thank you very much. Well, with Westminster roiling, widespread anger up and down the country, it's also a critical moment for the Labour Party. Having bided its time in recent months, the leadership has now called for Boris Johnson to resign, and the party's taken a commanding lead in the polls, consistently 10 or more points ahead of the Conservatives. So with an election potentially less than 2 years away, is Labour ready for government? I'm joined now by the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. Now, Wes Streeting, if your leader gets his way, you'd be Health Secretary sooner rather than later. So could we just dispense with the bit where I say, ask you about something and then you tell me what's wrong with the government's actions and go straight to the part where I asked you this. Given all the signs are that the Omicron wave, though not gone, is less dangerous than it was, would you be inclined, if you were Health Secretary, to relax the current restrictions at the next review on January 26th?
Well, we'll follow the data closely. We hope so, in that we don't want any more restrictions or measures than are absolutely necessary. I think the cautionary note we've got to bear in mind is that London might be over the peak of the wave. The rest of England is still bearing the brunt of it. And for lots of reasons, particularly population size, capacity and resilience, London's NHS system is in a stronger position than other parts of the NHS. So we can't be complacent about that. What I have done today, though, is send a very strong message to the country about the need to live well with COVID. And we've heard lots of Conservative MPs talk about living with COVID, and my anxiety about that has been two fronts. There are some Conservative backbenchers for whom living with COVID means ending all measures, including the testing regime and everything else. That's reckless and irresponsible. You've got the Health Secretary who says we need to live with COVID but doesn't seem to have a plan. So we set out 10 points that we think the government should introduce in order to live well with COVID in the longer term. Some are things they should do immediately, some are longer term objectives, but the goal here is to make sure that we never have to go into lockdown again and that we can move forward as a country protecting public health, but doing so in a way that protects lives, livelihoods and liberties.
So, in effect, you are already preparing for, as it were, the shift from a pandemic to endemic.
Yes, and I think that's the sensible thing to do. And you're right to say at the outset, we can't be complacent. We're following the data. I was reassured, actually, by what Oliver Dowden said about following the data, because I'll be honest, my anxiety reading the Sunday papers this morning was that this stuff about ending Plan B measures was driven more by the politics of the situation, Boris Johnson's personal political problems, needing to throw some red meat to backbenchers who might be writing the letters in, and trying to say, let's move on from the Downing Street parties onto Plan B measures and grab some headlines. So I want the government to be motivated by public health. And as you'll remember from when I came on before Christmas, one of the reasons why we signalled Labour support for Plan B measures well in advance of the vote was to give the Health Secretary the confidence to know he had the votes. So my message to him this morning, regardless of all the noise about Boris Johnson and the mess he's caused for his own party and government, let's keep public health at the forefront of our minds and let's plan on that basis.
Well, it's rather difficult to avoid the mess that, as you described it, that Ms Johnson's caused, if you want to put it that way. And just in passing, I apologise to viewers if I brought something personal into this discussion. Let's try and keep above that. Now, your party's obviously benefited from the revelations that have been coming out day after day. But let's just clear up one thing, because it came up yesterday. your own leader's not averse to a quick snifter during the working day, is he?
There's no comparison between Keir Starmer following the rules in 2021 and Boris Johnson breaking the rules in 2020. No comparison whatsoever. And I understand why the Conservative Party, unable to defend Boris Johnson, wants to now start going on the attack and smearing other people to cause distraction. But there is genuinely no comparison between the two. And I think what we've got to do is to show, going back to the point about the politics, that it's not enough for Labour, for the government to lose the next election. We've got to earn trust and win the next general election. And by the way, Trevor, I don't think you should apologise for talking about your personal pain, because millions of people up and down the country are having the same conversation. It's come up on the doorstep time and time again in recent days. And I think that image we saw of the Queen isolating, the reason why that image is so powerful is two fronts. One, it showed that people were following the rules. And if Her Majesty the Queen, who is actually genuinely the only person in the country who is legally above the law, thought it was important to follow the rules and set an example, why did the Prime Minister think that somehow he was above the rules? And what the Queen has done, as she often does, is epitomise a national mood and a national moment, and she took that responsibility seriously in the way the Prime Minister didn't. So I think people are furious and hurt. And actually, one of the most powerful interviews I heard this week was a caller into a radio programme who was in bits because he'd enforced the rules at funerals and was now asking if he'd done the right thing and felt terribly guilty about it. And that's what the Prime Minister either doesn't understand or doesn't care about, was that people were doing the right thing. We were all in it together. Boris Johnson and Number 10 weren't, and that's why he's unfit for office.
Against that background, and, you know, we don't have to argue about what you've just said, it's curious that, you know, Labour has said, rhetorically, Prime Minister must resign, but why is there no vote of confidence? Why are you leaving this to Tory backbenchers to sort out?
Well, I think there are three routes to the Prime Minister going. He could do the right thing and resign, but Boris Johnson and doing the right thing rarely appear in the same sentence. He can be removed by Conservative MPs through a motion of no confidence through the 1922 committee, and I understand more letters are coming in, but they're not there yet. Or he can be removed by the electorate. Those are the three routes to the Prime Minister going. And I think what Conservative MPs need to weigh up very carefully is whether, in the end, they are going to allow a toxic, radioactive Prime Minister to contaminate their party. Because one of the reasons I push back on the idea that they're all the same is that when things like this happen in politics, sometimes the voters do say you're all the same. I don't think we're all the same. I don't think most Conservative MPs were out breaking the rules. But voters will judge them if they defend the indefensible, if they stand by the Prime Minister, if they're complicit by their silence. And that's why they should remove him, because otherwise the voters will remove them at the next general election.
But hang on, I don't really understand this. I mean, one of the routes is a vote of no confidence in Parliament, which you could instigate. Why aren't you doing it?
Well, we could bring forward a motion of no confidence in the government. We've been around the blocks with this before. That would galvanise the Conservative Party. That would be the political dynamics.
How do you know that?
That would be the political
You don't know that
dynamics.
until you try it.
I just don't think that's true. I mean, I know Tory MPs well enough, Trevor, to know the way they behave. They don't want to bring down the Conservative government. I imagine they are concluding in their own minds and judgment and in their own consciences that Boris Johnson is unfit for office. The question now is whether they have the courage to act.
Well, look, I don't want to seem overly cynical here, Mr. Streeting, but actually there is a point of view that says that the people who most benefit from having Boris Johnson deeply wounded, damaged, but still in office is the Labour Party, and that actually, for you, having him clinging on in Number 10 is better for you as a party, even if getting him out, you think, would be better for the country. And that actually, all of this rhetoric is really just a way of making sure he stays there.
No, so I'm make no bones about it. Boris Johnson carrying on is great for the Labour Party. If I'm thinking about this purely through the prism of party politics, my message to Tory MPs is keep him on, knock yourselves out. Literally, you'll be knocked out at the next election. But we're still in the middle of a national crisis here, and the Prime Minister's actions and judgments matter. In fact, it comes back to the point I made about Plan B measures. If a Prime Minister or a health secretary from the Conservative Party's coming forward and saying we're going to remove Plan B measures, I want to be absolutely confident they're making that decision in the national interest and not in the party interest for party management reasons. I don't have total confidence about that. It's one of the reasons why in the coming days I'll be talking to leaders of the NHS and talking to government scientists and other scientists to get their independent, impartial view, because I can't trust that at the moment ministers are guided by one principle and one principle alone, which is public health before party politics. So this is not good for the country. I think Boris Johnson ought to go in the national interest. I know we'll be stuck with a Conservative government for a bit longer, and I hope it is just a bit longer. And the responsibility ultimately falls on us to show the voters that we're not complacent, we're not waiting for government to fall into our laps. We don't think it's the case that because the Tories are in a mess that people just flock to Labour by default. We want to win people's trust. I mean, that's why yesterday Keir Starmer did a big speech about the future of health and social care. He could have just banged on about Boris Johnson for 20 minutes and everyone would have loved it. But he did that speech to show the country that Labour has a plan, Labour has a vision for the country, Labour is ready for government.
Indeed. Well, he's made speeches like that before, and it doesn't seem to be working, because this morning's opinion poll, which puts you 10 points ahead as a party, has a rather interesting finding, and let me just quote what the Director of Research at Opinion says. When we tested possible successors to Johnson, while most of the Cabinet got negative ratings, nearly half of people say they think Rishi Sunak would be a good Prime Minister, a figure that is higher than both Labour's vote share and Keir Starmer's approval rating. So actually, your vote lead is really more to do with Johnson's unpopularity than the idea that the voters have had a come to Jesus moment with Labour and discovered that Labour is what they're looking for.
Well, we're absolutely not complacent. Keir is not complacent. Whenever we get new polls out showing a Labour lead, Keir is the first person to say, we're not looking at this through rose-tinted glasses. We've got work to do still to win back trust. But that's why in the new year, he did a big speech outlining his vision for the country and the principles that would underpin a Labour government, followed up very quickly by a substantial speech about health and social care. You'll be hearing more about this from Keir and from the rest of the shadow cabinet over this year, because this is the year where we will be saying to the country, we've got a terrible government, the country deserves a better alternative. Here is Labour's alternative, and that's where we'll be in 2022. All
right, one quick last question. Labour backbencher Barry Gardiner received over £400,000 from a source linked to the Chinese Communist Party for his political work. Will he and any other MP who benefited from that kind of money be required to return it by the Labour Party?
I don't know that we can require him to return it. I do think this is very serious. I do think that we've got a real issue here, which extends beyond one Labour MP. It's also about access to government ministers. That's why, to be honest, both of our parties aren't treating this as a party political knockabout. It's being taken very seriously by the leadership of both parties. We can't have a situation where a foreign government, particularly one hostile to Britain's interests on a number of levels, is able to directly interfere in our politics. That's what we've got to draw a line under. And I hope that very quickly we will be having a full review of what's happened, the lessons that need to be learned. We also need to act very quickly. Yes. The Intelligence Security Committee made a whole number of recommendations in relation to the Russia report. Many of those haven't yet been implemented. So I think there's an urgency to act. National security has got to come first.
Wes Streeting, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
The phrase famous civil servant should actually be a contradiction in terms. The Whitehall machine is supposed to whir away silently in the political background. But this week you couldn't really escape hearing or reading the name Sue Gray. She's holding an investigation into the parties held in Downing Street and elsewhere in Whitehall during the pandemic. Conservative MPs and Number 10 plead with us to wait for the conclusions of her report, as if she can determine the future of Boris Johnson. But actually, she can't. That is in his own hands and those of his party. But there are wider questions about civil servants and the culture in Whitehall. The FDA is the union representing senior civil servants in Whitehall and beyond, and its General Secretary, Dave Penman, joins me now. Good morning, Mr. Penman.
Good morning, Trevor.
Now, I don't mean to cause any offence here, but most people couldn't name a civil servant if they tried. But obviously, you'd have to be living under a rock not to have heard Sue Gray's name. Do you think she's being set up to fail by Conservative MPs and Number 10? Because actually, her investigation can't possibly answer some of the questions that I raised with Oliver Dowden, can it?
No, it can't. I mean, ultimately, Sue has been tasked with finding facts, and that's what the civil service is good at. The civil service, in its day job, advises ministers, collects evidence, as its duty under the Civil Service Code says it should. It should give evidence-based advice. And so even in these tricky political issues, what Sue will do is amass the evidence and present that evidence to the Prime Minister. Ultimately, this is an internal investigation, and the Prime Minister will have choices around what he does with that report, the degree to which he publishes it, what information he puts in the public domain, the decisions that will be taken for civil servants, because civil servants may face disciplinary action around this. But we then find ourselves with this kind of perverse position where if actually it demonstrates there's a question about whether the Prime Minister breached the ministerial code, only the Prime Minister himself can refer himself for an investigation. So it's not going to deliver what some people are put on it. But what it should do is deliver the facts.
But do you think, well, what do you think then happens? I mean, she just says this is what takes place. I mean, is the Prime Minister then going to be judge and jury on himself? I mean, how does this work?
Well, unfortunately, that's the case. I mean, ultimately, as I said, there's a lot of public scrutiny here and parliamentary scrutiny. So I think, if you look at kind of previous investigations, the investigation that was done into the Home Secretary, the Prime Minister sat on for 6 months because he didn't like the result. It was politically inconvenient to him, and when it was forced out of him, he just ignored it. So ultimately, the Prime Minister is going to have to think about what the consequences of dealing with any inconvenient facts that come from this report and the degree to which he publishes all of it or a summary of it. But really, the problem with our current system is when it comes to the Prime Minister himself, he essentially has a veto of whether he's investigated. And I don't think that's good enough. You look at governments elsewhere in the country, in Scotland, they're just introducing a new system with independent investigations and independent adjudication. We really need a better system for dealing with not only the Prime Minister, but ministers when it comes to oversight of their conduct.
I mean, I'm not sure whether you actually represent Sue Gray, whether she's a member of the FDA or not, but would you actually have said when this started that actually she probably shouldn't do this job and that it should have gone, as you say, to somebody completely independent of government, even independent of the advisor on ministers' interests, Lord Geit?
Well, ultimately, when this investigation was originally launched, it wasn't just about the Prime Minister. It was a broader issue about Number 10 and the revelations that were in the public domain at that time. I mean, more revelations have come out since then. But ultimately, this is the job of a civil servant. A civil servant doesn't get to choose. And Sue Gray is a formidable character. She has been used to dealing with the most sensitive political issues. She was head of the propriety and ethics team at the Cabinet Office. She's investigated ministers before and given Prime Ministers very difficult messages about those investigations. So there isn't anyone really in Whitehall better to do it than Sue Gray herself. But that's not really good enough for the public. The public need to understand that this is what the civil service does. The civil service is it's not independent, but it's permanent and it's impartial. And it has demonstrated time and time again that it can present a Prime Minister reluctant to receive those facts with the unvarnished truth. The difficulty here is what happens then. So ultimately, the civil servants will do what they've been asked to do, and they'll do it to the best of their ability. They'll do it under the Civil Service Code, where they'll be dealing with facts and evidence and tell the truth. And then we're left with how the Prime Minister will determine on those facts.
It's very difficult to tell exactly what's going to happen here, but of course there's endless gossip in Whitehall, and some of it is in newspapers today. We read that the Number 10 strategy appears to be to save Boris Johnson at all costs. Apparently it's called Operation Save Big Dog. That probably means that if that's what they want to do, some smaller dogs are going to get thrown to the wolves, if I can mangle the metaphor. Do you think that's fair? And what can you do about it? Because those smaller dogs are going to be your people, aren't they?
Yeah, well, I mean, ultimately, everyone has to be accountable for their conduct, from the most junior civil servant to the Prime Minister. When we were all under those restrictions, everyone had personal choices to make all the time, whether it was at home or whether it was at work. And I don't think there's any hiding from that. But ultimately, you have to ask yourself some questions about how a culture was created in Number 10, where this was deemed acceptable. And those in leadership positions bear the most responsibility for this. I mean, there's talk in the papers of a civil service culture. That's not a civil service culture I recognise after being around Whitehall for 20 years. It might be a Number 10 culture, but it's not a civil service culture. And certainly from reading what others have said, it doesn't even seem like a Number 10 culture from previous Prime Ministers. So I think ultimately, when you're looking at responsibility, those who lead a culture in an organisation, quite a small organisation in Number 10, there's only about 400 staff, who create an environment where these sorts of decisions can be taken, never mind potentially participating in them, then I think that's where there's a greater responsibility. And Sue Gray will know this. Sue Gray has worked in and around government for decades. She knows how these sort of manifestations happen in cultures within management. And I'm sure she'll be alive to that fact as well when she's considering her recommendation.
Okay. Let me just pick you up on this point about the culture, because it's not just Number 10. We saw it in Department for Education. We don't yet know where else this kind of thing has happened. Can you put your hand on your heart and say that there isn't a culture of, 6 o'clock, we've had a hard day, let's get in a bottle of a cheeky Merlot across Westminster? I mean, this thing seems to be quite normalised and not entirely contained to Number 10.
Well, I would challenge that, Trevor, because what we've got is one incident in another government department where there was a leaving doing a mistake made, and they held up their hands quite quickly on that. I mean, if you can imagine, I get calls several times a day from journalists trying to find dirt on what was happening elsewhere, and none of that's come out. Of course, I can't say what's happened in every government department, but my experience of 20 years around Whitehall would say this is not an environment and a culture that has got that sort of approach to it. Certainly not when you talk about in the middle of lockdown. This Number 10 was not the only bit of the civil service where people were in at their desks working 24 hours a day during the pandemic. About a quarter of the civil service has always been in, and departments like DWP, it's been 50% throughout. So ultimately, everyone has faced choices across government, and there are no real stories coming out about elsewhere. So I think, as far as I can be sure, this is not a civil service culture. This really is about Number 10.
All right. Dave Penman, thank you very much indeed.
Very much.
Well, as if there isn't enough going on in Westminster this week, it all got a bit 007 when MI5 issued a rare warning about a Chinese agent who had infiltrated Parliament and was influencing current and aspiring MPs. It meant some awkward questions for Labour's Barry Gardiner and others, and left many MPs already concerned about China's activities calling for a harder line. Leading those calls this week was Iain Duncan Smith, and he was, of course, leader of the Conservative Party in the early 2000s, at a time when the party also trailed Labour in the polls. So he knows plenty about the challenges to the leadership. He joins me now live from his constituency. Good morning, Mr. Duncan Smith. If we can start with the parliamentary issue, MI5 had to issue an urgent alert because of the activities of the Chinese agent affecting our parliament. And that established a link between the Communist Party in China and current and aspiring members of parliament. Now, in another week, we'd be talking about nothing else pretty much. But even in this week, it's still pretty shocking, isn't it?
It is. And the reality for us is that I think successive governments have been completely asleep at the wheel over this issue, completely asleep at the wheel. And the reality, therefore, is that we need to figure out where we are with China, whether we have a relationship or whether they are seen as a threat. If you look back at the Foreign and Defence report, you will see that they categorize Russia as a threat, but China as a competitor. And it does then lead you to wonder why that was the case. And the answer is, I think, that China over the years has so dominated us in a way that we are now completely dependent on them for a whole series of items and articles. They've got themselves into the position of being able to invest into our nuclear industry. Most of the solar arrays, the elements on them, are produced by slave labor from Xinjiang. The insides of most of the wind turbines that we have are all made in China. We've become utterly dependent, and far too many officials and ex-ministers have then left and retired and gone and taken money from China. So the very fact that they are in trying to persuade and infiltrate and subvert people within our political system is nothing new at all. But the worst bit about it is that the government, too many governments, seem too cautious about calling it out. This is a brutal, dictatorial, ghastly regime, and we seem to want to, I think, kowtow to them too often, and that's dangerous, and you've seen the results of that. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, I can promise you.
I wonder if you could be clear about why this is such a big problem, because politicians take donations from all sorts of people, don't they? And part of that undoubtedly must be because those people want to influence those politicians. And, you know, we elect, we hope, independent-minded people who won't be swayed. Why is this particular issue such a big deal?
Well, number one, we're dealing with a regime which is committing genocide. We are dealing with a regime that has trashed a British, Sino-British international treaty on Hong Kong. We're dealing with a regime that is locking up peaceful democracy campaigners and threatening Taiwan. We also deal with a regime that has killed Indian soldiers on its border in disputes and has taken over the South China Seas and has threatened everybody and anybody, and is now subverting countries in Africa. You see the other day that if they don't pay their loans back, which they're given, I saw the other day, I think it was in Sri Lanka, they've taken over a port pretty much. I mean, this goes on. We are not dealing with a European regime or an American regime which is democratic and accountable. This is a brutal, disgusting regime. And what they're after is making sure there can be no criticism of them. So they can break every rule that they wish, and they do, and therefore we won't. And after all, let's just be reminded of one thing. You know, COVID-19, whether or not we believe it came from a laboratory or not, you know, the communist regime of China refused to let the world know of the scale of the problem they had until very late on, well over a month and a half before they told officially the WHO. By the way, the WHO themselves seem conflicted because they should have been asking direct questions, but they didn't. The result is that has spread around the world. So when you're dealing with a regime like this that doesn't tell the truth, that doesn't open up and is brutal, then this sort of thing, you know, millions have died as a result of that. So we can't just treat the Chinese government as any other government. You know, so when they start infiltrating, when they start subverting parliament, and when they start paying people off, we've got to be much, much, much more brutal about it. And Australia shows us the way to do this, which is to ban involvement with the Chinese authorities and China in critical circumstances.
Well, just very quickly, though, we've identified one individual, Christine Chin-Kui Lee. Do you believe that there are other people doing this?
Oh, absolutely, certainly. I think this is the tip of the iceberg. Let's just look at universities, for example. In plain sight, you've got the Confucius Institute, which offers to pay to help students understand China. In fact, what so much of it does is to spy on Chinese students. Many of our universities have become completely dependent on Chinese students. I was talking to one the other day that had allowed members of the embassy to come to one of their debates about China so they could literally spy on who was saying what. I mean, this goes on everywhere. You know, if you look at where their money goes, whether it's Huawei or anything else, you know, it's all about subverting us and making sure that they can undercut the bid contracts, etc., and win contracts and win over the UK. So it's very important. We recognise China as a threat, not as a competitor.
Right. Forgive me for interrupting you, but I want to move on to, of course, the issue of the day. And let me be absolutely straightforward in asking this question. Let's leave the technicalities and even the kind of small politics out of this. You've done the job. Do you think that Boris Johnson is morally fitted to remain as leader of the Conservative Party?
Well, one rule I always made for myself is not to enter the world of morals. And I'll leave that to those who practice and preach and deliver religion. And once politicians start lecturing about morals,
forgive me, you will have been talking to your constituents this weekend.
Completely different issue.
It would be hard to imagine that question is not being asked between them and to you.
Well, is it a morality question or is it a question about whether or not these things should have happened? So let's remove the two and just deal with the reality. This is unforgivable. There is no question that what has been going on, and despite your previous interviewee, has unearthed a culture which has become lazy and slack about what happens after hours, what happens in offices. Most businesses wouldn't allow what was going on in the offices, even though people have been under pressure. This was in the middle of lockdown with oppressive rules about what people could and couldn't do. And there's no question my constituents, other constituents, are quite rightly very angry about the fact that many of them were having to obey what some of us felt were over-onerous rules, but nonetheless they were rules. And yet there seemed to be others doing things that they weren't able to do at the heart of government, or maybe across government too, in other departments. So the key thing here is this was wrong. There is no question for it. There's no explanations. There's just apology and contrition. And we have to see now what Sue Gray comes up with, to the extent of it, who was responsible and how this all worked.
All right, let me take the word moral or morality out of my question and put this to you again, because you've been there. Isn't this a matter of character? And isn't the danger here that the character of your leader is essentially defining the Conservative Party and potentially losing people like you, with your not gigantic majority, your seat?
Well, as I said earlier on, this is not an issue about quibbling as to why or wherefore. This is about understanding that responsibility always in these issues comes to the heart of it all. And it's about the Prime Minister's authority and about his decision-making, and whether or not he knew or understood what was going on is a question that Sue Gray will settle. But there's no question right now that this is an appalling set of circumstances. It should not have happened. None of them should have happened. What I can't understand is why there wasn't a sign nailed up on every door of every government department, including Downing Street, that would have said simply, when you have finished your work, go home. Go home, not stop by. And that sort of level of understanding is beyond me, and I can't figure it out. So absolutely not. I mean, I'm as appalled as anybody else. I'm as appalled as my constituents. It's simply appalling, one way or the other. But we have to see, finally, we called for this inquiry. Let us see what it comes up with, and then we will make our decision.
Forgive me. Thank you very much, Iain Duncan Smith. Thank you for your time this morning.
Pleasure.
Now, we've understandably talked a lot today about the future of the Prime Minister and party politics in Westminster. But believe it or not, there are other very, very significant things happening abroad right now. The Pentagon says Russia is planning to fabricate attacks as a pretext to invade Ukraine. Again. Russia's dismissed the claims, of course, but has 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border, and talks between Moscow and NATO ended in failure this week. Earlier, I spoke to Kurt Volker, formerly the US ambassador to NATO and the special representative to Ukraine. He's worked under Presidents Bush, Obama and Trump. I started by asking him how dangerous he thinks the situation is.
I think it is very real, very dangerous, probably the most dangerous it has been since the last time Russia invaded, which was 2014. You remember then that Russia stealthily went into Crimea, used little green men and special forces, took over Crimea, did the same thing again in eastern Ukraine. And there's now been a war going on at a very low level for 7 years. About 14,000 people have been killed on the Ukrainian side. But it appears as though Putin has put in place all of the forces necessary to launch a fresh, new, large invasion. And he is making all kinds of threats to the West and to NATO that if he doesn't get some kind of guarantee about Ukraine being under Russia's sphere of influence, he's going to do it again.
It's thought unlikely that he would simply march across the border. The Pentagon says that Russia is planning a so-called false flag attack to fabricate a reason to invade. Do you think that's how this kind of thing starts?
It can. It's not the only way, but I think it can. I think what Putin was attempting to do, or what the Pentagon is saying he was attempting to do, was have Russian special forces acting as though they were Ukrainians, attacking the Russian-led forces in eastern Ukraine in order to give them a reason to come back and attack those forces and go massively into Ukraine. That's one way to get this started. There might be other ways as well. If you remember, in 2014, Russia used regular military and special forces in unmarked uniforms to take over government buildings and declare an insurrection. And then when Ukraine tried to put down the insurrection, massively flowed in so-called humanitarian assistance, which turned out to be a lot of weaponry and a lot of troops. But I think that sort of thing, softening up the target, creating the pretext, it's also why he wanted to have these meetings with the US and NATO to get a rejection of his ideas. He's trying to create the pretext for justifying going into Ukraine again.
So that's how you read the talks in Vienna this week, which seem, frankly, to have got nowhere.
Yes, and I think entirely predictable. Putin knew that the demands that he put into the texts that he gave to the US and NATO in December would be absolutely unacceptable. NATO is not going to say no countries can ever join again. NATO is not going to say that we will withdraw our military protection of the Baltic states and Poland. NATO is not going to say that Russia has a right to determine the future and security aspirations of its neighbors. Knowing that, why would he then propose these things? I think on the one hand, of course, if we were to give him that, he'd be happy. But more realistically, he knew he would get a rejection, and he wanted to show that he made the effort at dialogue and diplomacy, but he was rejected. So he, quote unquote, had no choice.
There's been a lot of activity this week. Ukraine was hit by a massive cyber attack, warning its citizens to be, quote, afraid and expect the worst. Now, we don't know who exactly is behind that attack, but if it does turn out to be Russian or Russian-inspired, because you've seen something similar in the past, what action could be taken?
Well, first off, let's analyze that attack a little bit. There have been cyber attacks against Ukraine, against Estonia, in the United States, against our election system, in Germany, even in the UK, I believe. So it would be fitting the pattern for this to be Russia, and surprising if it's not. Second, what is the message here? It is psychological pressure on Ukraine. We can attack your government ministries anytime we want to. We can put up our messages on those ministries. And we only did the civilian ones this time. We didn't do your military. The implicit threat being, we can do your military. So I think this is a lot of psychological pressure on Ukraine. As far as what can be done about cyber attacks, it's probably too late to prevent things now. It is something that all of us need to do in the West, in Ukraine, in our partner countries, help them build resilience against cyber attacks. But it's something that needs to be done constantly and with vigilance, not something that at the spur of the moment we can change.
Mr. Putin has massed 100,000 Russian troops on the border. He says, I can do what I like on my own soil. But it's evident that this is at some level a kind of intimidation. What do you think his larger game is here? What is the point of all of this?
Well, I think it is what he said it is, which is he wants to prevent Ukraine from ever being admitted to NATO. He wants NATO to basically agree to tear up the Helsinki Accords and this idea that every state has a right to its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Every state can choose its own alliances. This foundation of security in Europe that's been in place for 50 years. He wants to tear that up and replace it with something more like Yalta, which is there's an Eastern sphere of influence, and that's ours, and there's a Western sphere of influence you can play there. And
this is a deal between Stalin and Western leaders.
Correct, yes. He's looking to go back to that as opposed to the arrangements for European security that have been in place for decades. And I would connect this to a vision that he has. Remember, he was a KGB officer in Eastern Germany. He was deeply disappointed with the fall of the Soviet Union, called it the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, and believed that it was the fault of the leaders of the Soviet Union at that time to allow that to happen. I think he sees himself in the mode of a builder of the greater Russia. And he seeks to acquire territories, as he's done already with Crimea, or occupies parts of Ukraine, of Georgia, or the soft takeover he's done in Belarus and possibly even now in Kazakhstan. So I think he sees himself as reassembling the pieces of a greater Russia. And this happens, of course, in the anniversary year of the founding of the Soviet Union. I think he'd like to emerge from this year having shown that he has built something big.
Let's get to the sharp end of this. You've spent a lot of time in talks with Russians. You've been involved in the politics of the Ukraine for many years. Do you think, in reality, that it is a real possibility that he could invade?
Yes, I would say that in my way of looking at it, it is more likely than not. His rhetoric has escalated to a point that will make it very hard not to follow through. It is clear that the West cannot give him the guarantees and demands that he is seeking. And I think that he actually will want to make some kind of invasion, some kind of territorial acquisition, but he'll want to do it swiftly. He'll want to stop within a short period of time and then try to connect these territories of Crimea and Donbass and maybe other parts of Ukraine and make them part of what is a sphere of influence for Russia by action, since he's not going to get that by words from NATO or the US.
Well, you say he won't get it by words. So what can NATO and the US do? For example, I guess there's some people who think that maybe to accede to the demand that Ukraine would never join NATO would be one way of at least getting him back to the negotiating table.
Well, what it would do is it would give him something and cause him to think, well, what else should I be getting as well? He's not going to stop with getting his demands met. We've seen this movie many times. And moreover, it is not for us to sign away the rights of 40 million Ukrainians. It is for them to decide the future of their own country. Now, what the US and Europe are doing is threatening massive retaliatory sanctions if Russia does invade again, increasing these military presence in NATO allies in Eastern Europe, and increasing security assistance to Ukraine so they can better defend themselves. But all of this is being framed as a response if Russia attacks again. And I think that what we really should be doing is taking all three of those steps, but doing it right away as a deterrent to such an invasion, with a promise that we could wind down some of that if Russia stands its forces down and we're no longer negotiating under the threat of the use of force.
So you would stand next to former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo when he criticizes the Biden administration for basically talking and not doing, because Pompeo has said that Putin is prepared to push to the brink, is his expression, in Ukraine to get what he wants. You are in favor of more aggressive tactics.
Well, I wouldn't describe what I said as aggressive. I do believe that we need to be doing rather than talking only. And I think that he's right about that. But helping a country get the armaments and training so it can defend itself is not an aggressive step. It is a prudent one to help stave off such an invasion. Putting sanctions against a country that is now using extortionist type threats against NATO, against Ukraine, against Europe, that's not an unreasonable thing to do either. And we'd be willing to lift those sanctions if Russia stopped its intimidating activity. I don't see these as aggressive moves, but I see them as prudent defensive moves to put in place to try to stave off something worse.
I was interested in the Pompeo intervention. Is this a sign that Mr. Pompeo is now gearing up for a run in 2024? Is this the opening of the political hostilities for the elections in states later on this year and then the 2024 presidential election?
Yeah, I read an article yesterday where there was a debate about when did the 2024 presidential election campaign begin? Is it 2022? Was it in 2020, just after the January 6th riots? Or did it actually begin in 2020 before the 2020 election and people were already jostling for 2024? I think it may have been the latter as well, too. No one knows at this stage who is going to run on the Republican side. it is quite possible that former President Trump would run again. There are a number of strong Republican candidates, Mike Pompeo among them, who might want to try as well. A lot of them are doing the kinds of things you need to do to prepare so they can make a decision later if they choose to run. And I think Mike Pompeo would be one of the stronger candidates if he did.
Well, that's as much as we've got time for this morning. Obviously, the news isn't going to stop, and we will be back next Sunday with more exciting and perhaps over-emotional politics. In a moment, I'm going to talk to Sam Coates on The Take.